Awesome.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this month's webinar, The Gardens of Pompeii, presented by the North American Cambridge Classics Project and sponsored by Cambridge University Press. Jenny and I are so delighted to have Margaret-Anne Gillis return this evening as our guest presenter. Margaret-Anne, in case you don't know, is an expert on all things Pompeii. She has some amazing pictures and stories to share with you this evening. She retired from teaching last year, and since then she's had the opportunity to make many trips to Italy and elsewhere. She also serves on the NACCP board. Margaret-Anne lives in Barrie, Ontario, and she has taught the Cambridge Latin course for, golly, what, 25 plus years now. First, she was at Barrie Central Collegiate until it closed in 2016. And then she started a Latin program at Innisdale Secondary School. So as I said, she knows everything about Pompeii, and her pictures are always amazing. And we are just so delighted that you can participate with us on this journey this evening. And we will record this session, and in a few days, we'll post the link on our website. And on that note, Margaret-Anne, we'll let you get started with your amazing photos.
Oh, that's very kind of you. That's very, very kind of you. I'm still learning, as the case may be. Every time I go to Pompeii, there is something new to enjoy. So thank you very much. And I just thought I'd put in a very brief plug, which we will come back to at the end of our presentation. So as Cicero said, if you have a book and a garden, you have everything you need. And so if you will indulge me, I was thinking about what kinds of things do we talk about in the Cambridge Latin course that might be useful for teachers to address with their students in this time of our, focus on the environment and climate change. And how do we really address our interaction with that? What was it like in the ancient world? And what are the resonances between then and now? So I thought, let's look at the gardens of Pompeii. And so it's a little bit of an eclectic journey, but please bear with me if you've got questions. I'm going to try and keep my presentation as short as I possibly can, more to allow for questions and discussion. But here what you see next to our good friend Cicero, and this picture was taken from the Capitoline Museum, is you see a beautiful fresco that was taken from the garden of the Villa Occidentalis, which is very close to the Forum in Pompeii. And one of the things that really struck me about this is there's a picture of a garden in a garden. Why do you have a picture of a garden in your garden? It seems overkill, but then there is this notion, from the ancient world that being in the rural environs was the perfect place to be. I mean, think about it for just a second. Romulus and Remus, saved by a wolf, raised by a farmer. What were the very best things you could do? Farm. How did senators make their money? They had to farm. Why did Roman soldiers put their lives on the line? Because they would get land at the end of it. Pompeii, for instance, was actually taken by Sulla so that he could settle his veterans there. If you think about it, we have this enormous craving in and of ourselves to have a piece of land, even now that we can, put a little garden in, right? It's the same thing. Think about it from the perspective of, our good friend Howard Gardner. One of the multiple intelligences is the natural intelligence, right? And from COVID, we became very connected to the outside. And so I thought this might be a really interesting conversation for us to have with our students, maybe in stages 1 to 4, and then maybe again in stage 12. So here we are. And I thought we'd start. This is really how I wanted to build the presentation, because if you look at these very famous gardens that you see, these parks in all of our major cities, here you have Hyde Park, which is in London. Over here, you have, of course, Central Park from New York. I have never been there, but it's absolutely, breathtaking. If you come down here, this is a beautiful park in the center of Paris. And then because I'm Canadian, I just had to throw this in. Here is Hyde Park from Toronto. Again, look, you have city all the way around the park. So it's like the city is embracing parkland, right? We need this green space. And I thought this might be a really interesting way to look at how Pompeii itself is portrayed. So here we have a map. You can't see all of the green spaces that are there because every single house has a garden. It doesn't matter how large, it has a garden. And so what I thought we could do for the purposes of this discussion, which gardens do I choose? And it took me forever, and I kept putting in gardens and taking them out thinking, no, that wasn't really what I wanted to do. So I have limited my discussion to just a few key gardens, and we talk about those a little bit. And then I'll look at some industrial space inside the city as well. And how do we know about gardens? Well, thank you to this woman right here. She is an American classicist by the name of Wilhelmina Jastrzębski. And why is she so, okay, so this is just a little plug. As a Latin teacher for so many years, this woman did her undergraduate degree in math and Latin. And then when she did her PhD, she did it in Latin and she looked at Roman law. She is not a trained archaeologist, yet she pioneered the whole notion of garden spaces within ancient urban environments and has written 2 books about the Garden of Pompeii. And she used the Fiorelli process to inject plaster into the spaces left by the rotting roots of the plants that were in Pompeii. So many of the gardens that we see are the direct result of her 23 years in this site. And she took with her her husband that you see there, Stanley, and Stanley was a physicist. So I'm sure that the 2 of them, together were using a combination of classics and, science to try and make this happen. But you'll see here at the very bottom, that is a root structure. And we're going to come back to that because she's really responsible for giving us what Pompeii looks like today when we go to see the green spaces that are within it. So I was at a lecture a few years ago, and the scholar who spoke to us at that time, who is from Emmanuel College at Cambridge, his name is Nigel Spivey, he was talking about the layout of houses. And I thought this might be really interesting from the perspective of, as we go through, we want to talk to our students about houses, the way in which a house was actually laid out and the use of that. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of little things in Pompeii, little nooks and crannies, lots of buildings. We have public buildings, religious buildings, commercial buildings, domestic buildings, but they all have a specific function and purpose. And a house for us generally is where we live. But if you take a look here at the house of Caecilius, which we have here, and of course, you'll all recognize this because this is in the early stages of the Cambridge course. This is the standard that we have for a house. And over here, we have our street, and our house comes right up to the street, which means that it's in a very public place. People can look in the front doors when they pass by. Oftentimes there are shops on either side of the front door. You'll have outside, your clients waiting to come in to see the Patronus each day. And if they get to come into the atrium, that in and of itself is a very good thing because sometimes they didn't get to come into the atrium. But when they moved into the atrium space, of course, they're getting closer and closer and closer to the Patronus himself. And frequently, even if they're on the other side of the door in the street, or if they're in the atrium itself, they have this tantalizing glimpse of a garden just beyond. But you only get to go to that garden if the Patronus actually invites you into the house. If you are a family member, if you are a close friend, if you are an important business associate. So the house has a very important function from that perspective. It's like our backyard. It's okay to go up to somebody's, front door passing through their front yard because that's kind of a pseudo public space. But you don't go into their backyard because that's where they could be sitting at their pool or, having a barbecue with friends. There's this kind of notion of what belongs to the public sphere, what belongs to the private sphere. And so this is one of the things that we have to understand when we look at these gardens in Pompeii. The purpose is that this was the space for the family to enjoy, for them to decompress, for them to have an opportunity in a very busy urban environment to have some connection with nature itself. So if I'm going too quickly, just let me know. So I thought what we do is we would walk down the Villa dell'Abbondanza, which is of course the street of shops, to the very end of the street. kind of on the precipice of what we here in Canada would call a green space. Some of our cities have these wonderfully delineated sections, which would be called green space. You can't build in it, it's there for nature. And I thought that we would start by looking at then what you find at the end of the Villa dell'Abbondanza. So we find a couple of structures. Now, of course, the one that we all recognize over here is, of course, the amphitheater, built to house, the entire population of Pompeii and the surrounding areas for many of their entertainments. But if you look next to it, you'll see number 7, that's the palaestra. And if you take a look at that space, it's almost square footage wise exactly the same, if not a little bit larger than the amphitheater. Number 5 is what they call the Forum Boarium. Now, these are public spaces. They're set out for the people of Pompeii to come and enjoy. And then if you look at 2, 3, and 4, those are all very important and very wealthy houses bordering on this. So there would have been a lot of movement in that area. But I think these houses were built in this space in order to allow them to really be able to stretch out and expand. And so what we'll do is we'll just return, if you would indulge me, to the Pradia Giulia Felice, because the reason for this is that this house, of course, as we discussed last year, is a whole block's worth of house. It was turned into kind of a very high level inn. This was the way in which she made money. In fact, a lot of the artwork that we take for granted in the National Museum comes from her particular house. And it's massive. This house is absolutely huge. And the first thing you see when you walk in the front door, so here we've come from the Via dell'Abbondanza into the front door, there is the atrium space here. And you walk immediately into the garden because this was set up as an inn for influential and very wealthy individuals. And what I love about this in particular is that the first thing that this house does is it kind of embraces you and encases you with the garden that she has. So if we look to the back of the house, now we're in the garden right here. I have never seen these beautiful, fluted, very narrow, kind of rectangular columns. I've never seen that. They're so elegant. You can't believe that they're actually supporting the weight of the roof. And then you have these beautiful frescoes on the side of the walls facing into the garden. You would think that the garden would be enough, but it's not. Artwork is everywhere that you look in the garden. So you have not only the greenery of the plants that are there, thank you to Giuseppe for being able to tell us what was there, but you also have these beautiful frescoes. And one of the things that we come to know is that at this time, just prior to the eruption of Vesuvius, you can see that water features play a particularly important role. So we have right here, right at the edge of the garden, as soon as you enter it, this is the bath complex, which we looked at last year when we were speaking. And directly in front, which would be here, is this enormous, almost like an infinity pool. That's exactly what it reminded me of, right? To have all of this water in the garden, and facing out from this room right here is this gorgeous dining room, this summer triclinium. And if you've ever been to Hadrian's Villa at Tivoli, it's the same setup, only his is massive, of course, because it's out in this large imperial estate. But here you have water coming down the waterfall, coming out where the people are eating, and then trickling back into the garden itself. So it's kind of this system of self-irrigation, if you will. And then if we follow this path right here, all the way down and around, we come out to the other side of the estate into this enormous wall garden that had all sorts of fruit trees. But it was meant not for everybody, but just for the people who stayed in this house. So it'd be like if we wanted to go to like a really nice hotel or what have you, we wouldn't be allowed to avail ourselves of all of the things that were in that hotel unless we were either patrons there or we were paying for the privilege thereof. And that seems to be what's happening here. I just wanted to show you a couple of pictures from inside the bathhouse because, here's this small enclosed space. A bathhouse was meant to be a small enclosed space. And yet there are so many windows looking out into the garden so that they could actually enjoy the bathhouse and still enjoy the garden at the same time. And so you have that. They don't even have to leave and go to a public space. They have that opportunity within the house, but they can also enjoy the surrounds. Now let's go next door. So if we go immediately next door to the house of Julia Felix, we have Venus on the half shell. This house isn't always open to people. And what's really tantalizing about it is when you come in, the entrance, which is right here at A, you can't get a clear sense of where the garden is. The walls block it. And it's interesting because not all houses are like that, but this one is. And you walk down this long corridor of all of these shrubs, and there are paintings all the way around. Even the columns were painted on the bottom. I'm not sure if you can see the ochre that was right here. I'm really sorry. Some of my the angles of the light didn't pick it all up, but that's actually ochre on the bottom. And then you have these beautiful frescoes all the way along the walls, and you are greeted by this massive picture of Aphrodite on the end. And there you go. So we have Aphrodite in the center with her attendants. We have Mars over here. And then we have another picture of, reminds me very much of what you see in, if you've ever been to the museum in Rome, the Palazzo Massimo, where we have the dining room of Livia from Prima Porta. The colors are the same. They're muted. This is a very tranquil space. And we are very fortunate to have this because this area of town where we're looking at right now was very heavily bombed by the Allies during the Second World War. So that we have these bits of artwork left is really quite a testament to, I think, Amadeo Maiuri racing to try and talk to the generals to say, please stop bombing what is really a treasure for the world, but also to those people who were able to conserve what was left and preserve it here on the walls. So you can see why people would want to come into this space. It's relaxing. It takes you away from the bustling city that's outside. I mean, they're at the very end of a very busy street. If we go next door, and this is the house, it's not always opened. If it is, this is the place I really love to go because it has the most spectacular garden of anything I have ever seen. It's the house of Octavius Quartio. It's also called Laureus Tiburtinus, but it's actually the house of Octavius Quartio. And when you come in, the front entrance, which is right here, you are greeted by the most spectacular fountain for the atrium I have ever seen. I've never seen anything like it, not anywhere. Pompeii has this, this incredible series of different houses, all with very similar layouts in terms of the design of their homes, but these little tiny nuggets of great things. This would have had plants in it. This actually even had a fountain in the center, and you can see it right here. And then you walk through, and the garden is really quite astounding. The house itself is small. The actual domestic space is small, even though this is one of the largest houses in Pompeii. It's not because they wanted to waste the space on where they were living over here. It's because they wanted to have the most spectacular garden of any place in Pompeii. And there it is. It's hard to describe it. I apologize that I don't have my pictures. I need more space. You know what they need to do with Zoom is they need to give you more space so you can do like these telescopic wide angle things so that you can show it. But basically, when you walk out, there is a triclinium here, and across is a biclinium. And then you have this beautiful, right here is a little shrine. This is all a water feature. It was painted blue. We have all sorts of little tiny, these are little statues. Generally speaking, they show Egyptian themes for all of these little statues, which are here. And you walk across, there's a little water feature right here. This is a fountain that comes down and the water trickles down into this. And then when you walk, this is, if you are standing at this fountain right here and looking backward, there's the continuation of this. You know what really strikes me, however, is people who have in their homes, if they have a pool and you have to put a barrier around your pool because you don't want people to accidentally fall into this. Yeah, not in these houses. There doesn't seem to be any kind of safety feature whatsoever in any of these houses. So you have to be really careful, and you train your children not to fall into the pool. This is about 1 meter deep, by the way. Sorry. And when you continue out the back, by the way, this figure right here, and we find a lot of him all the way through Pompeii. I'm not sure what this means, but this is a little Narcissus figure, which I thought was kind of, interesting. Whenever we have water, we seem to have a Narcissus with it. This is the backyard that I wanted to show you. It is just incredible. It goes on and on and on. This pool, which stretches from the pool that we just, sorry, I'm demonstrating, but it's actually here. This pool just continues to go on and on. It starts right there. So here we are. We just walked from this position right up here, and we go down steps 6 feet. So you could not enjoy this garden unless you actually were admitted into the atrium and admitted toward those triclinia, biclinia. There's no way, because it drops down 6 feet. So the privacy that would have been afforded this family was incredible. And here in the center, that is a fountain. And they suspect that this allowed for the aeration of the water so they could actually keep fish in this pool. And on the walls, Jastrzemski, when she was in here doing some investigations, found that there were very faint fragments of paintings along the walls. Unfortunately, a lot of that was destroyed because it was bombed during the Second World War. And there was this arbor. Do you see how they've got this right here? This arbor actually stretched all around there and was covered with vines. You'd feel almost like you were walking in a jungle, in a forest, because you would be entirely enclosed by plant life in this garden. And it's the most spectacular vision that I've ever seen inside a house for controlling water, because you can imagine how calming that would be. There might have been a posticum, so a little tiny door at the very end to go out. That could have also been as a result of when they rebuilt it during the Second World War, but this would have been an entirely contained garden space for people who could have afforded it. All right. So I wanted to look at something. Those were very grand houses. I mean, if you think about it, the house that I just showed you encases about 3,000 square meters, which is a very, very large house. This one is small, and it's right across from the house of Menander. So we've just left this area right here, and we've moved over into this area. And the reason why I wanted to show you this is it doesn't matter how big your house or how small your house, you make a garden. You have a garden scene. You have something. So this is the house of Gillis. Sometimes it's called the Casa della Caccia, and I'll show you why. This right here, by the way, is a plaster cast of the door. Every time I go by it, it just takes my breath away to think that that door was still there and they were able to get a plaster cast to show you the size of it. And here you can see where there would have been space for people to wait outside in order to be called in. And so when you start to walk up the front door, and this is just a very, slight little incline, and it takes the shape of the hill, you can see very tantalizingly that at the very end, there is a picture. You get a slight picture of what is at the back of the garden, this beautiful fresco that's there. And so I wanted to show you. If you can't bring yourself to the outdoors, you bring the outdoors in. And if your house is really small, you make a mural of something that would take you into the wilds of, the frontiers. And the reason I wanted to show you this, not only because it has these beautiful colors. I mean, imagine what this would look like, in its heyday when all of these were bright and vibrant. But it reminds me of the cave paintings at Lascaux. Do you know this need to have contact with wildlife? And so here what they've done is they've literally created a vista to make the house look larger. But if you look down here, you'll see that this would have had plant material. There is the drainage trench for the water. This is a very small house, but it had a very great garden. And so I thought we'd go back here for just a moment, if you'll indulge me to go back to the end of the space where we were. And I thought we'd talk a little bit about what happens if you don't have money. So there were about 2.3 million, I think if I got 2.3, 2.9 million people who visited Pompeii last year. And it's down a little bit before COVID, but it will rebound. And I imagine because of all of the things that they're doing in this site, it's going to rebound a lot. And so one of the things that always strikes me, and this is a conversation I always have with my students about, people who have money. When we go to Pompeii, we see the houses of the grand, of the wealthy, of those people who had lots of money, who didn't really have any kind of, worries in the world. essentially because they had money to survive and they had beautiful environments in which to survive. But what about the poor people? We don't have any evidence of them because all of those upper floors, all of those insulae were destroyed as a result of the eruption of Vesuvius. So where did they go? Where did they live? And I'm taken back to at the very beginning of COVID. I was reading an article about the importance of Central Park in New York, because Central Park allowed for people who lived in very tight and cramped environments to go out and get fresh air, to walk and see the sun, to enjoy being out of doors. And in times of, sickness, influenza, cholera outbreaks, that was really important to allow them to have access to fresh air. And it kind of, rang a bell with me because I thought, well, wouldn't that be the same in Pompeii? I mean, if the majority of your inhabitants live in insulae, crowded above the houses, these grand houses, and there is no way that the person who owns that house is necessarily going to give access to their garden to their tenants. Why would they? There's no reason to do that. Well, where would they go? This city is really densely populated in the summer months, particularly when people from Rome come to live here. So I started to think, well, maybe that's why the palaestra is so important. And here's just a vision of what the palaestra may have looked like when they started to do excavations of it. They found about 52, 53 bodies in this site when they were excavating, which kind of points to the direction of people came here to take shelter, but maybe because this was a prominent place for people to come and take shelter. And you can see it right down here. There's the palaestra. Over here, you can see the amphitheater, and you notice that they're roughly the same size. And inside the palaestra, you see this beautiful indentation. That's a swimming pool. So they could escape the elements by walking around underneath the enclosure of the palaestra. They could go out and have fresh air. They could sit in the sunlight. It is a large enough space to allow many, many people to be there. So perhaps people who lived in insulae, or perhaps people who were, destitute and perhaps unhoused. And then one of the other things that I wanted to point out right up here is this. Now, this was called the Forum Boarium. And when Jastrzębski did some of her excavations inside this, she noted that it was used for growing grapes. So I put this little sign, I'm not sure if you can see this, the Villa of the Mysteries right here. That's because every year they harvest the grapes. Pompeii, they press them, and a little business called Mastro Berardino actually prepares wine called Villa di Misteri. It's very expensive. They only bottle 600 of them a year, but I'm told it's a wonderful, wonderful wine, very, very smooth. So if you ever have an opportunity to buy some Villa di Misteri wine, perhaps it's something where you could get a sense of why the people of Pompeii love this region so much. But I wondered if maybe access to this would have also given people an opportunity to walk within, green space as well. And again, at the end of the Villa dell'Abbondanza, so people could make their way easily along the via, but also to have some additional space for all of the individuals who might not have had these houses. So this picture actually was taken from the website Pompeii. If you go there, they have an excellent website the Parco has put up, and you can see these little tiny indentations, and that's because right here, and you can see my picture of it there, there's one of Jastrzębski's roots. So in actual fact, there were lots and lots of plants on the interior of that, which would have provided not only open space for them to exercise, but also shade from the sun. Okay. And of course, we have one of the most famous gardens of all, and this is the Garden of the Fugitives. And I won't talk about that very much, but what I wanted to point out was these individuals lost their lives because they literally got caught behind a wall. They thought that they were on an area right here between, and what ended up happening was they got themselves caught on this side of the wall. So they weren't able to make their way to the street that leads to New Caria. Nocera today. They got caught there, and that led to their peril. And if you look back, I'm just standing, when I took this picture of Vesuvius, I'm just standing up on the walls looking down into this site. And what really struck me about that was that there is a lot of green space. There were a lot of houses that seemed to have made over a significant part of their backyards to more agricultural things. And that brings me to
This meeting is being recorded.
So here, number 15 is the house of the ship Europa. And I apologize for the lack of the quality of this picture. I tried every angle you can imagine to get this graffito, and it doesn't matter. You try this angle, you try this angle, you get people to stand and block the light, it doesn't matter. This is right here, if you take a look at it. This is what that graffito tells you. So there's something about this house connected to sending goods off. And this house, if you take a look at it, has been remodeled. And all of this green space in the back, that has been made into a little micro industry. And we've seen this. We've seen houses that have been repurposed before. The Foolery of Stephanus was actually a very nice house that was subdivided, and the foolery was put on one side. So this doesn't mean that this wouldn't have happened in other houses in Pompeii. We have an excellent example right here. So when you walk into the front door, there we go. We're walking toward the atrium. You'll notice this beautiful artwork. I know it's kind of chipped away and it's worn, possibly because of the, the comings and goings. This is an industry that you see in this house, but it's exactly the same decoration that you find in the House of the Dancing Faun, just to point that out. So this house had, money at one point in time. It had prestige. They valued the artwork that was in it. And then, of course, it becomes turned over. And if you see all of these amphorae, and if you look here very carefully, you will see how these columns have been walled in because the house's use has changed. It has now become a factory. And at the back, you can see that they had garden space. The majority of this house was turned over to a micro agricultural enterprise inside the city. They grew beans, they grew cabbage, onions, they had fruit trees, they brought in olive oil for olive production. And I'm not sure how well you see this, but this is actually used. They would turn this handle right here and the wheel would move, and that would press your grape or your olives. So they were able to produce olive oil for export, it seems, from this house. So when we think of Pompeii, we think of all of these grand houses, they were there, but sometimes we also have a change in the function. And part of that was bringing agriculture inside the city. And I really just want to emphasize that because it's going to take me toward the end of my presentation. So if I could ask your indulgence, I thought here we had inside the city, we looked at spaces that had, were set out for domestic purposes, or in the case of the House of the Ship Europa, we had an agricultural endeavor. I thought, if you would indulge me, I would take you 5 kilometers north of Pompeii to Boscoriale, to the Villa Regina. And the reason is, we all know this, we've seen this in our book, because stage 2 opens with this beautiful cubiculum right here. That cubiculum was taken from this little rural house. And so it has just been recently reopened to the public after a very extensive renovation, and you can go inside. And what's beautiful about this, this is very close to Caecilius' house. So remember in stage 12 when he sends, Clemens to go and check things out at his rural estate, that rural estate was not far from this little rural estate right here. And what's really neat about it is that hardly anybody goes here. So if you are ever traveling with your students, I highly recommend that you take them to this site. It is so close by. And with nobody going, you have the site virtually to yourself. You can see that we were there on a Sunday and we had the site virtually to ourselves. Very few people were here. The museum is spectacular because it features all things that you would find at an agricultural estate. And one of the things I wanted to point out is you can see all the way around it. You're going down about 70 feet here, down into the ground. This is the Roman level right here. You can see beautifully the stratigraphy of all of the material that fell from Vesuvius. And one of the things that is very striking is this. This is the plaster cast of a sapling tree that was blown over by the winds. So you can imagine how the pyroclastic material was blowing across this region, and it had the strength to blow that tree over. And then it was covered in material, and the excavators were able to put plaster into it. So here we see the back side of the estate. Here we see this was actually a chicken yard. This will lead you into the stable. So there was a stable here. But if you notice from this room, this is actually a very high class, very high status, very wealthy individual who owned this little rural estate. And it was used for the production of wine, which is fantastic. So here, this is my friend Susanna, who is a tour guide. She is 6 feet tall. So just to give you a sense of how large this entranceway is, these here are wooden doors, casts of wooden doors that had actually broken during the eruption, but this is what remains. And this is the main hallway. You can see right here, there's the lararium, which is next door and adjacent to this. This room was where they would bring the grapes in through here, and they would be pressed into wine that you see here. This is right across, so where Susanna is standing right there, there's a little Quartio right there where they would collect water. That's where you would get your water for the site. And if you see the little plaster cast of the piglet, we always think of the dog that we see from the house of Ausonius Primus, but when you see this little plaster piglet, it kind of reminds you that there were a lot of different types of animals that also perished in the eruption. And one of the things that the tour guide pointed out when we were there was that frequently it seems that farmers would allow their natural domestic pigs to run wild, and they would actually mate with the local wild boars. And apparently it actually improved the quality of the meat that they were able to get from these animals, the size and the meat that they would get from them too. So I thought that was kind of an interesting, thing to focus on when you're here. And then of course, this is the door we just came in through. And here we see these dolia. These were used for housing that wine. And when this area was excavated, there was still wine remnants inside of these dolia. If you look here, this is the triclinium, which looks out onto this central courtyard, and you can see it's as finely painted as any one of those houses that we would have seen in Pompeii itself. And then of course, right here, this is an example of how they did the second floors. We don't really see that very much in Pompeii at all. And it's kind of unnerving because I'm quite short myself, but this space is only 6 feet. So you can imagine then if they were putting in second floors in houses to the tune of 6 feet, you can imagine how claustrophobic that would make a person feel. And so this area right here was used as part of the barn area for the house. So this is where they would keep their horses or other animals, and then it would face out into that little courtyard that we had seen. And so what I wanted to do was kind of end off with, we started with the house surrounding the garden in Pompeii, and I wanted to finish where the garden surrounds the house in Pastoral, so that you have both an urban house and a rural house, and how they really did honor the environment in which they found their architecture to be set. So I think that brings to conclusion my discussion about the gardens of Pompeii. If you have not had an opportunity to look at some work by Wilhelmina Jastrzębski, or you're interested in maybe further, using this information for your kids in class when you're talking about, what went on in Pompeii, please do look at her books. And there's also a website that uses about 100 different gardens that she looked at in Pompeii, Pastoral, and Oplontis. So I thank you very much for your very kind attention. If you have any questions or you would like to ask me anything, I think I finished a little bit earlier than my time, but that's not always a bad thing. So thank you very much. And I'll just turn this over to Martha.
Well, once again, thank you so much, Margaret-Anne. The expertise that you have on this area is just really remarkable. And you obviously have been to places that most of us have never seen. And I hope this will inspire some of you to think about the places that she's been and either go yourself and or take your students. And on that note, I would encourage you to ask Margaret-Anne some questions at this point.
Thank you.
Feel free to speak up.
Yes, I would love it. If there's something that I missed, if I could elaborate on anything, I would love to do that. I'll stop my share. There we go.
Okay, could you give us a website for the gardens you just mentioned?
Oh, I'm sorry, I just missed that. Oh, the gardens, do you mean the Boskoreale or do you mean Wilhelmina Jastrzębski?
Leslie, which one do you mean? The latter one?
Sorry, had to unmute. It was the latter one, although honestly, I'd love to have the website for a couple of these, just because it would be pretty to be able to look at them.
Yes, yeah. I forget now what the website is for Jastrzębski, but if you Google it and it'll take you right to that. You can look it up. She has tons. It actually is a wonderful clearinghouse because you can just go down a list of the various houses that she has done some research on in the gardens, and you can click on it. The other one too is Pompeii Sites. If you haven't seen that, Pompeii Sites is fantastic, and it actually takes you from beginning to end of some work that she did at the house of the oh my goodness, my brain is fried. Occidentalis, the Villa Occidentalis, and she's looking at spaces in the ground that she actually said were vines. So she thinks that beyond that, the land that was there, they had turned into using for the production of grapes for the house. Oh, sorry.
I have no idea how to spell the woman's name.
Oh, Jastrzębski,
Yes.
Jashemski, Jastrzębski, Wilhelmina.
Do you know if she was the one? There was a woman who was an archaeologist who had figured out the types of plants that were planted in a lot of the gardens in Pompeii from the root structures, and she was giving my little bits of the I forget what you call it. It's not really lava. It's really light that came down, and I have had it for years and have passed it on now because I'm retired to a student of mine who still teaches. But it would be so much fun for them not only to know where this came from, but now they could go to pictures of the gardens and actually see the gardens that their little piece that they're passing around the room so that they touch the real piece of Pompeii came from.
Yeah. That's Jastrzębski, Wilhelmina Jastrzębski. Yes. So
unmute yourself, Beth.
yeah, just jump in.
I was just thinking there would be so many great connections. Like my school and probably all of our schools has just been doing activities about Earth Week and connecting environmental issues and causes for all of our activities and curricula. But I was thinking, what would you say in looking at all of these gardens? Are you inspired with any thoughts that would connect to activities that we could use for Earth Week to sort of highlight how much we can learn from the ancient world about the preservation of the natural world?
I think, if you look at the fact that every single house had a garden, every single house. Now, they didn't always do plantings where they grew their own vegetables, say, but they had garden space around them. And if they couldn't have a large garden, then they painted a garden on the wall. There seems to be a real respect for green space within a city. So you can see that with the 2 palæstra that they have in the city itself. You can see that with the agricultural land that they made space for within the walls itself. And also their use of water, because their water was made, so those water features were used to irrigate as well. So it wasn't just flowing through their house to create this wonderful fountain effect, but it was also used for their garden. So kind of like we would use, I guess, with gray water. So I think anything where we could point out the fact that there was a respect for the natural environment, because it would be so hard for them to collect water and to use it, right? And the notion that you want to have as much green space around you as possible. So every single house in Pompeii had a garden of some sort is an important venture, I think, because it's the same thing where we want to go out and plant a tree, or we go out and we pick up, garbage from the street, that kind of thing. I think you see that it's subtle, but it's there. Yes.
I also always thought about the fact that we have lawns and we put it all out there for the world to see, whereas their space was their space, and they brought the garden in to be part of an exterior room for them,
Yes.
and again, to your point of affluency, the more affluent you were, the more fun it was to do interesting and different things. And again, going back to COVID and the lockdown, so many people discovered their backyards and all of a sudden started buying, 2 sets of furniture, the couch and chairs and the dining room set, and putting a gazebo up and all that,
Yes.
because much more of a space you used.
Yes, exactly. And I think too, we are now starting to look at, issues around climate change a little bit more carefully as a result of that, because now we're interacting with our natural world more and we're paying attention to these things.
Yeah.
I think that's important. Absolutely. Oh, sorry. Just check the chat. Sorry.
Mary Redline gave us Pompeian pictures.
Yes, Pompeii in pictures. Amazing, amazing, amazing. And many of the pictures that we take for granted for finding from the site actually were taken by Wilhelmina Jastrzębski's husband, Stanley. You'll see him with the photo credit. He must have had unlimited access because he was taking and posting pictures of all sorts of houses now that are actually closed to the public, but he has tons of pictures, especially of the house of Caecilius. Yes. Is there anything else that I can?
Well, Leslie asked about the biclinium, a dining room for 2. That was new to me
Yes.
too. So tell us.
Yes. So a biclinium, it's interesting. There are a few houses that have them.
Just
So it's just 2 beds. Yeah, it's 2 beds that intersect, and they can tell because the mosaic in the floor is done such that people who are lying on those beds can have an opportunity to look down and enjoy the artwork. So you see that they actually have the footings of the beds there. So one had a triclinium and the other had a biclinium.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
I have a question. I remember being at a talk a very long time ago, and someone saying something about in one of the summer triclinia that there was a fountain, but that basically you put the table on top of above the fountain, and the water would like make everybody's feet cool type thing. Yeah.
Yes.
So that didn't exist. I didn't imagine that. Okay.
Yeah. And it's because in some cases where you have and I didn't know this, one of my colleagues was telling me about it, but when you have a fountain itself and the fountain is spritzing water into the air, it's the result of those little water droplets being evaporated. That's what creates a cooling effect. So for them, it would have been kind of like a really rudimentary type of air conditioning, essentially. But yeah, and they didn't see, like, I think we would find it uncomfortable to sit with that much moisture around us, but they seem to actually find it very cooling. Maybe it also cooled the stone, because if cold water touching the stone, it might also have had a cooling effect,
Well, I think of bars that you sit at in certain places, like in the Caribbean and stuff, and the whole seat is in, you're still in the pool,
Yes.
It's not to that extreme, but it's that kind of conscience.
Yeah.
It's true. Or when you're at those, in Pompeii in particular, there are a couple of restaurants where they put water dispensers in front of the fans. So they're kind of spritzing you with cool water. You come out from lunch and you're damp, but they're,
So Leslie also asked you to get to the villas that you mentioned. Is it on the Circum Vesuvio?
Yes, absolutely. You can take the Circumvesuviana. Actually, and not that I am not paid by Pompeii at all. But if you buy a little thing called My Pompeii card, there are a couple of things. If you follow them on Facebook, if you have My Pompeii card, which is 36 euros, it's good for 1 year. It gives you unlimited access to Pompeii, Boscoriale, Oplantis, the houses at Stabia, Quisisana, which is a lovely little museum dedicated to the artwork found from Stabia. And if you use that, you can get, there are also special admissions. So let's say they're opening a house today that's usually closed to the public, like Octavius Quartio. If you have My Pompeii card, you get in. So you can get that online. You go to the site itself with your identification, you pick the card up, and it's brilliant from the time you activate it for 1 year. And you can get there easy on the Circumvesuviana. In fact, Boscoriale is only 1 subway stop away from Pompeii, and it's not even 500 meters walk north of the Villa Regina subway stop, and you'll make your way right there.
That's great.
Sorry.
Well, it is always such a pleasure to have you. You just have so much enthusiasm and so many new and wonderful things to share with us. Thank you so much. And for those of you in attendance, if by chance you need a certificate for this evening's webinar, please do not hesitate to email us training@cambridgelatin.org, and we will get you a professional development certificate very quickly. And as Margaret-Anne already mentioned, we are getting geared up for the summer workshop. It's July 10 through 14. We're going to change the model up a little bit this summer. We're going to do day 1 for the newbies, brand new teachers, and then we're going to do 1 unit per day, unit 1, unit 2, unit 3, unit 4. And we hope some of you will join us this summer.
And it's one price. You come when you can. You don't have to stay for everything. And we have 2 presenters each day who have made it their business to own that unit, so it's we aren't going to do the stories from 41 to 48, but pretty much everything before that will be covered in great detail in some way, shape, or form. So it's well worth coming.
We thank you for attending this evening. Have a great evening and good night.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. And I have to agree with you on Boscoriale. This is Mary Redline. I walked from Pompeii to Boscoriale, and there's nobody there. And I got to the museum, and they had 5 guards, and I was the only visitor. And they were questioning how I got there because they didn't hear a car pull up. And then the whole thing, then, say, oh, Signora Americana. And, I asked them about these publications, and they were so concerned that I walked in this heat to come out to see them. And so when I finished, then you have to go outside and go up that that ramp that goes up. And they had me sitting down. They had a fan on me, and then they invited me to their workroom. And while I was there, the one guy had made a gelato run, and he had stracciatella gelato, and they had the best fresh cold cantaloupe. And I'm sitting here eating cold cantaloupe and stracciatella ice cream. And then they did the La Presentazione. And so the books I had weren't in English. So they gave me for free the publication on how to do the molds of the calci, the Giuseppe Fiorella, and they gave me another booklet for my classes. And then they were working on the restoration, so I didn't get to see the insides and stuff. And then as I was leaving, this yellow car comes up. Here it's one of the security guards. He didn't think I should be walking back to the train station on my own, and he said, "Signore, il taxi, your taxi," and he drove me back to the train station for the Circumvesuviano. to get back home. So, but I mean, 5 guards for one person, right? You know?
That's a great story.
But yeah, and I've been to like, well, yes, and Herculaneum, Atlantis is